everyone. My name is Ethan Song. So I'm the current director for the cybersecurity research team. So for this semester, we were looking into video game console exploits, and we're kind of, seeing what exploits are being used and how it kind of works. We kind of dive deep into that sort of field. We also kind of talked about, what we can do with a hacked console. So we'll be talking about that as well. So we're going to kind of divide all the exploits into, I guess, 3 or 4 main categories. So for one, we have the payload exploit. The other one is web browser exploit. Then we have the game application exploit, and we have hardware hacking. All right, and I'll have Lily take over for this slide.
Okay, so the first type of hack is a payload exploit. So what it is that it involves using a USB or SD card or even a direct connection to the computer to push files onto a console. Examples would be the PS Vita and Switch hack, where you would push a payload via USB to a PC to run on the device. And also the PS3 hen hack, which uses a USB to push update files to revert the PS3 to another version of the operating system. And to give you guys a better idea of what payload exploit is, I'll briefly explain the setup for the PS Vita hack. So to start off, you would need some materials. First, you need a SD2 Vita adapter, and it's used to put an SD card into the Vita. An SD card, which is to download applications and games that you would want on the PS Vita. A Sony Vita memory card, which is for the PS Vita 1000. The PS Vita 2000 does not need one since it has its own integrated memory. And the PS Vita charger to USB, which is for connection to the PC. The PS Vita uses the charging cable that came with it, and the PS Vita 2000 uses a micro USB cable. So after you have gathered all these materials, the next step would be to connect the PS Vita to your PC, install HN Core 1 or 2, and run the application, and the PS Vita would basically be hacked.
Thank you, Lily. We'll also be talking a little bit more about the PS Vita for our next example. So what we have now is the web browser exploit. So what this usually does is some consoles, they have web browsers built into them, which also kind of gives us that HTML functionality. So this is another way that we can attack the console. So for example, the PS3 hen hack, after you revert the PS3 operating system to a previous version where it has an HTML exploit, we basically go to the website and just straight up download the custom firmware from the website onto the PS3. And another one that we have is the 3DS browser hack. This is an older hack and it no longer works, but you were able to go to a certain website, which basically attacks the web browser and almost crashes the 3DS. So you can go into that like vulnerable state where you can download all of your homebrew and custom firmware. So moving on, so this is kind of the continuation with the PS Vita exploits. So there's 2 main ones, the older being the Henkaku, which is the browser exploit. And this is super simple because all you really need to do, you just go onto a website, you just install a file and you just run it on the PS Vita and your PS Vita is hacked. And the second one, which is for the more updated versions, this kind of falls under the payload exploit. We would need a connection from the PS Vita to the PC where we transfer some files from the PC to the Vita, run it on the Vita, and then it gets hacked. It's pretty simple and really only takes like 20 minutes. Question? So Henkaku, basically, there's a lot of small things that it does in the background that I'm not too entirely sure of, but basically it kind of just unlocks the system, if you will. And once you have that unlocked, you can download a bunch of homebrew applications, apps that have been made by other people online. So we'll talk a bit more about homebrew a bit later, and I have a demonstration for the Vita, and I'll kind of show you what you can do with it. All right, so moving on, game and application exploit. So this usually just exploits a bit of an application or a game that's on the device itself. So for example, we have the DSI hack, and there's two there's two hacks, I believe. One of them is called Memory Pit, where you basically load a file from the camera application and it crashes the entire system because it's a file that's a bit too large that the DSI can't really handle. And once it crashes, we can just run unsigned code and get Homebrew that way. And there's another one called Flipnote Lenny, which functions in a very similar manner where it kind of just crashes the entire application and it allows us to run unsigned code. But this uses the Flipnote application rather than the camera app. The Memory Pit that uses the camera app, this was actually discovered in 2019. So this is pretty recent considering how old the DSI is. And it's honestly pretty easy to do. And the next one is using Cubic Ninja. And this was kind of the first attack that was successful on the 3DS. And this uses the game Cubic Ninja, which had a level editing software inside, but you could use codes to kind of share and receive levels from your friends, right? But this code kind of just runs without checking what it is. So you could just write commands instead of an actual level code and just download whatever you want. So there's some wild exploit. So I guess going on into more of the in-depth examples, we have the 3DS Banner Bomb 3 exploit. So this is sort of the second step to the 3DS hacking bit. So for the first step, you would kind of get an encryption key by using a micro SD card to get a string of code, and that code would be the encryption key. And once we have the encryption key, we would use another application within the 3DS called the DSI data management, where using the encryption key, we build this fake sort of operating system. And from that, we can download all of our custom firmware and stuff like that. And going on to the next one, we have the Wii letter bomb exploit, which is pretty fun and easy to do. This basically, we basically get a file onto the Wii and we kind of just open it using the Wii messaging board. And once we do that, it sort of just, once again, crashes the entire program, installs Homebrew, and goes on like that. All right, so for the final one that we have is hardware hacking. So hardware hacking is really fun, but it involves a lot of soldering and I guess a lot of knowledge about computer components. So for one, we have the Xbox Kamikaze attack, which is basically you just, all right, in the top picture, there's that little yellow square. And in that yellow square, there are two very, very small wires that we need to cut. Once we cut that, the DVD drive, rather than checking whether the DVD inserted is an Xbox game or not, an official licensed Xbox game or not, it doesn't go through that check. So now we can just have random DVDs kind of just go in and immediately run on the Xbox 360. And this was called the Kamikaze hack because if you cut any other wire next to it, it kind of just screws up the entire DVD drive and you will no longer be able to use it. And kind of looking at the older consoles like the GameCube and the PS2, those generations, since they don't really have, I guess, a operating system to really exploit, we would need to get past that through hardware hacking. And going on to the more in-depth example. So we have two for here. So for one of them is a Wii tweezer attack. This was one of the first attacks done on the Wii, where you basically use a tweezer and ground certain points. And once we ground these said points, we can kind of expose the RAM and see what information is within the RAM. And by going one by one, we can kind of see the entire contents of the RAM that we usually shouldn't be able to see. And once we see that, we kind of get the encryption key. And once we have the encryption key for all the data on the Wii, we can basically, write our own programs using the encryption key and just kind of push it onto the Wii. And going on to the Xbox 360, the Xbox 360 in general is very interesting because it has a system called a hypervisor. And the hypervisor, basically what it does is it's kind of like an admin system that checks everything on the Xbox 360 and basically prevents you from doing anything on the software side of things. So when we talk about the Xbox 360, it's mostly going to be hardware hacks because to this day, I don't think there's a single, software exploit for the Xbox 360. So there's two main ones called the JTAG and RGH. So what JTAG is, basically on the Xbox 360 motherboard, there are these two ports called GPU JTAG and CPU JTAG. And CPU is for the central processor, GPU being for the graphics portion. And the JTAG unit is a port that's used for, I guess, the developers or IT professionals who kind of, need to use it to debug. So people like us, who just play games and just buy it for, media causes, we, don't have access to it. And what the hypervisor does once we turn on the Xbox 360 is that it immediately shuts off for the ability to use the JTAG function. So what we do, we get a mod chip and solder it onto certain points. And as it turns on, it kind of disables the disabling function of the JTAG ports. So now we're able to screw around with the JTAG ports and do whatever we want with it. So basically just, run all of our custom firmware and stuff. Yeah, it's
standard computer ports.
It's a certain spot on the motherboard, and the JTAG is basically like, say your Xbox 360 is broken, they might want to use the JTAG portions of the Xbox 360 motherboard to kind of check and see if the GPU and CPU are okay, that sort of thing.
What other exploits, like what are the use cases that you guys have for this?
As for the use cases for the JTAG ports, I'm not too entirely sure. There wasn't too much information back when I was looking into this. But yeah, this is mostly for, the consumers don't really aren't supposed to touch it or mess with it, essentially. And the next one is pretty fun. It's called RGH, and it's basically a brute force attack that slows the CPU to a halt by constantly clearing all the threads on it. And basically threads are these sort of like a processing unit, say. So if you have a game running, it might be using like 4 threads or something along the lines of that, right? And once we kind of use this brute force that constantly clears the CPU of any threads, we can almost kill the hypervisor system that overlooks the entire system. And once the hypervisor system is dead, we can, download whatever we want to on the Xbox 360. However, this is a very slow process, and every time you turn on the Xbox with this hack, it takes a very long time because it needs to go through that entire process of slowing down the CPU and then killing the hypervisor and then, running all the homebrew. So it's a bit of a long process. So a lot of these exploits, question? So the last hack, can you use that on other consoles? It's possible, but I'm not actually sure whether other consoles use it, because if you think about it, right, the hypervisor system is like unique to the Xbox 360. And for other consoles, in the case that they might use a similar system like the hypervisor that kind of overlooks everything, you might be able to. I'm not too sure. Yeah, so hypervisors, it kind of just shuts down anything that you're trying to do via software. Like say if you're trying to get an application to crash and kind of like download a custom firmware that way, as it crashes, it kind of like prevents you from doing anything else with it. Sort of, it locks the system down essentially. Yeah, the RGH, I haven't seen any like kind of similar attacks to it because honestly, when we're attacking a console, we'd rather attack it through software because it's just more accessible and easier for a lot of people. So I haven't seen any use cases that is similar to RGH, unfortunately. All right, so we'll be kind of talking about the combination of exploits. For some of my previous examples, I kind of talked, there's a lot of, I guess, combination between, using web exploits and then going on to another exploit and so on. So like the PS3 hen, we use a payload to downgrade the operating system. And then we use the web browser to get the CFW using the exploit on that. And the DSI memory pit, we first need to use an SD card to get a specific file from the PC to the SD card. And once we load that SD card to the DSI, we can use the application hack and kind of just go on through there. So things that you can do with a hacked console. So a lot of people, they usually hack a console to emulate. That's one thing. Backing up games, which basically allows you to play a certain game without actually needing the disc. So for consoles like, say, the PS Vita, where it's a very portable device, you might, you can't carry all those cartridges around. So people, they would hack the Vita in order to sort of have all these games in a downloadable format. So they don't have to constantly swap out cartridges. And the next one, we have a bunch of homebrew applications, which basically support the console even after, I guess, their main manufacturer stops any support. So for example, the PS Vita has been long gone unsupported, right? But there's a bunch of, there's a huge community right now that's kind of like porting games onto the PS Vita. There's a lot of quality of life patches. Like the PS Vita, it usually isn't able to have a battery indicator, but with this homebrew app, you can just have it on, which is really convenient. So media application, you can kind of like turn an Xbox or Vita 3DS or whatever into kind of like this media application where you can read PDFs, MP4s, audio files, and stuff like that. And right, so I kind of mentioned the game ports, where games that shouldn't be normally be able to run on a specific console, people would kind of modify the code of that so that way it's playable on other consoles. For example, the PS Vita, Sonic Mania is only able to run on a couple consoles, a couple modern consoles as well as PC, but someone was able to port it so it's playable on the PS Vita. And basically what you can do, like there's so many things that you can do with a hacked console. It basically opens the device for everything. Everything you want to do, you can just kind of screw around with it. Because at the end, consoles are all just computers. And once we hack it, we kind of get that full computer access and do whatever we want with it. So I actually have a live demonstration. So I have this PS Vita right here that's connected to my laptop. Give me just a second. Okay, there we go. So basically, usually you aren't really, I guess, allowed to kind of just hook up a PS Vita through a USB connection to your laptop or computer and kind of share its screen. But by using a homebrew application, or rather a config file that I downloaded last night, I'm able to kind of share screen and share audio, although I don't have the 3.5 millimeter jack for it. So basically, this is a PS Vita. So as you can see, we have the battery indicator on the top right, 100%. And usually you aren't supposed to have that, but by editing, I guess, a file within the console, we can easily, get that battery percentage up there. There's also the background. So this background is, it's not actually available on the PS Vita store. This is all just a custom background that someone made. And there's a specific application where you can kind of just modify how your PS Vita looks. So there's a lot of customizability there. So these are all the applications that I used. So Vita Deploy, ITLS Enso, and HNCore. So these three were the applications that I used to download all the files. It's really just pressing, yes, okay, download, and it just hacks just like that. You can do this on the PS Vita 1000. The 1000 and the PlayStation TV, they all have the same operating system. So since it's a software hack, they all basically function the same. All the steps are the same. And so this one is a registry editor, which basically allows us to kind of edit all these values that we're usually not able to edit. So for example, it's hard to tell, or I don't think you can tell if I'm sharing my screen like this, but I made the LCD screen just a little bit brighter by kind of modifying a value that's supposed to dictate the brightness setting. And the one over here is called Save Manager. This basically allows me to go through all of my game saves and kind of apply cheats or modify the save files in one way or another. So we have all this. And going back, we have PKGJ, which kind of allows me to download ROMs online rather than needing me to connect this to a PC, download it on my PC, and then transfer from my PC to my PS Vita. This kind of just makes me, this allows me to kind of just download everything in one go. Next, we have VitaShell, which is basically the file editor, because most of the time, consoles, they don't come with a file editor or a file manager. So we can't actually see what's going on, right? But with this application, I don't think it's working. But basically, we can see all the files and, kind of mess with any config files that there might be. Sorry, give me just a sec. All right, my PS Vita decided to restart, so I'm gonna have to wait a bit. But basically, so kind of the functions that I showed you, the registry editor, the save file manager, and the file editor, those three things are kind of the, I guess, main things that you can find on a hacked console. So for the 3DS, so I hacked this as well. And this basically gives me a save file editor as well as a file manager and all that, all those useful tools. There we go. So kind of looking down here, so we have the custom themes manager. This is how I got my backgrounds and all that. Auto plugin 2 is also part of the, I guess, initial process of hacking the device. It gives me all the applications that I guess, kind of need. And finally, we have the Vita Homebrew browser. Unfortunately, I'm not connected to the Wi-Fi, so I can't actually show you the applications on it. But we have a bunch of quality of life applications, media applications, as well as game ports that we can just download and play. So for, I think recently there's been a lot of games being ported from Android to this device, and it's usually you're not supposed to do that, but people manage one way. So for example, right here, I have a Fallout 2 game, and this game, released like in the early 2000s or late 90s, I believe. And it's really only released for the PC, but people have looked at the source code, and from the source code, they can sort of reverse engineer it so that way it's playable on the PS Vita. And so we have emulators, and this is, I guess, the fun part right here. So for one, I have RetroArch, which is a pretty cool emulation device. It basically allows me to emulate a bunch of systems kind of all in one. So in here, I have the SNES and GBA emulation in here. And next thing that we have here is Moonlight. Moonlight is basically a streaming, I guess, application where I can stream whatever games I have on my computer from my computer to my PS Vita. And the last one that we have right here is called Adrenaline, which basically allows me to emulate a PSP and a PS1. Since the PS Vita is basically built on the PSP, which is the previous generation of this console, I can kind of play all those PSP games and PS1 games natively. So that's pretty convenient. It's basically about it for the Vita itself. So I'll leave the grounds to, I guess, any questions that anyone might have.
I can't remember which. Good? Yeah, good. I can't remember which Mario game it was, but I remember one of the earlier Mario games.
Mhm.
If you moved in a certain pattern, you actually inject code into the game.
Right. So the question was, in a certain Mario game, if you were to move in a specific way, it's possible to inject code. Do you know what the console this was on?
on the SNES, Super Mario World.
Oh wow, Super Mario World. Okay, that's interesting. I personally haven't looked too much into I guess the older generation like this SNES. But yeah, I guess honestly, if there's I guess like a game breaking bug or even a system breaking bug on a game for a specific console, that bug can basically just kind of, crack open that shell and allow us to inject code. So if, that specific pattern of movement somehow crashes not only the game, but the system itself, then yes, it's definitely possible to kind of inject that code that way. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, that's one good thing to mention. Moonlight basically works off of NVIDIA GeForce or GeForce Experience, I believe. That's what it's called. So the PC that you want to stream from must have a NVIDIA graphics card. So that's one thing to know. But I believe there's some workarounds to it. There might be other applications out there that sort of have that same streaming capability without having the requirement that the PC has a NVIDIA graphics card. I'm not too sure though. So yeah. The research team, we haven't really done any hacks because I rather have everyone be in person and do the hacks themselves. That's why we're having the workshop. During the workshop, we'll be going over, we'll be soft modding a Wii, which is probably one of the easiest consoles to do, but there's a lot of things that you could do with the soft modded Wii. So we'll be going over that. I personally have hacked PS Vita, 3DS, and PS3. So yeah. Consoles that I haven't been able to hack. Xbox 360 lying around that requires a bunch of hardware modification that I have not not willing to touch because that Xbox 360 was a gift from a long time ago. So I kind of have some. No. Mm-hmm. Another question. Steam Decks. So hardware modifications to the Steam Deck. To be honest, I'm not too sure because so I guess this is kind of the cool thing about the newer generation of consoles or devices because the Steam Deck was basically meant so you can manipulate it in any way. So kind of, I guess, hardware manipulations, there might be some of those. I'm not too entirely sure. But in terms of software, you can do whatever you want with the Steam Deck. In addition, the most recent generation of Xbox, the Xbox Series S, I believe, there's a way where you can get a developer mode where you kind of basically hack the entire system because Xbox is giving you the entire, I guess, system access and you can kind of just download whatever you want. So there really is no need to hack the latest generation of Xbox.
Like you actually got my hand. Physical wires that you have to cut.
Mhm.
Any other wires will mess up the entire thing.
Mhm.
I guess a maliciously or a hacker with malicious intent or a pen tester perspective. Do you think it was a trial and error thing that someone with an overabundance of Xbox 360s had just free reign of, or like was there a logical way that they could have deduced, oh, it's these two wires?
All right, so the question was regarding the kamikaze attack and whether it was kind of just by chance that they stumbled upon it or it was like a kind of logical deduction. That's a really good question. To be honest, I'm not too entirely sure, but I remember there's a kind of video on this topic that kind of goes into Xbox 360 hacking. And I believe they kind of pinpointed where they should make their attack onto this very specific piece. So those two wires that you saw, actually, let me pull it up right now. So basically the two wires that we needed to cut, being these two right here. So that chip is basically responsible for checking the disks and making sure it's not like a pirated copy or something of the sort. Because all Xbox 360 disks, they have a little I guess, piece of code that's not usually seen on typical CDs, right? And this, I guess, component was basically responsible for checking and making sure that it has that Xbox code right there. And basically, I think from that, they kind of deduced that they can, somehow use this specific chip. To get to those two wires, I'm not too entirely sure whether if it was logical or kind of just by chance. I believe it was logical though, because they kind of saw those two wires going into specific components where, well, it's only, the check and won't actually break the DVD drive. Oh, question?
Are there any hacks for like the new consoles, like the PS5?
Yeah, so the PS5, I think recently someone found a way to hack the device, but there's no way to run unsigned code, which means that we can't, download Homebrew application. We can't put ports on it. So while it has been hacked, we can't do much with it, but it's also kind of like, this console can be hacked. So that's kind of a good sign. And, we'll just have to wait and see if there's any more exploits that we find. I also believe that it was patched like a day after the hacker posted about that. So, all right. There's a question in the chat. So since the newer generations of consoles allow more functions like web browser access, but have more security features, do you think they are easier or harder to jailbreak? Honestly, to jailbreak because they're basically getting this is their X number of generation, and it kind of saw what exploits were used on previous generations, so they're definitely going to patch those out and kind of keep those in mind. And yeah, so functions like the web browser, so they do allow for, I guess, more like vectors of attack, sort of like which direction we can attack from. But yeah, the companies like Sony and Microsoft are definitely going to kind of know it's exploited. So more complexity, more vulnerabilities. So if we actually look at the Switch, right? And initially, if you compare the Switch to like the PS4 or the Xbox One, we can kind of say that, the Switch is so lackluster, there's a store and that's kind of it, right? But since there's a store, no web browser, no nothing, I guess there's an SD card, but you can't, you kind of just plug it in. You can't do much with it. Since there's only kind of the UI and operating system has like very, I guess, not a lot of apps, there's not a lot of things that we can exploit. And because of that, Switch hacking has been pretty hard over the years, with one being, a specific hack that only worked for the earlier versions of the Switch. And after that, they were all patched. And it's basically, for the time being, impossible to hack. 2.0 on the PS4, yeah, through the browser. Yeah, so basically browser attack. Yeah, more complexity, more vulnerabilities. Questions? Haven't seen too many. I guess this is where someone would hack a device to kind of use it for forensic analysis. Most of these hacks are more so to kind of just play with the hardware and kind of do things on the software end of things. Much on the forensic side of things.
How the heck can someone figure out to go into the level that
was, how would people kind of like find things, pinpoint all these I guess exploits and kind of go from there? And isn't this kind of like a trial and error thing? I would say it's kind of like a trial and error thing, but I think there's also a lot of logic behind it, because I guess the way that the 3DS hack runs, let me pull it to that slide real quick. So the Cubic Ninja hack where we basically put code in the level editor code thing, and it kind of just runs that code. Basically, hackers kind of have a keen eye on things to look for. So especially when they're looking at, things where you input a code and the game runs it, they'll try, obviously kind of going through that route. They're kind of seeing like all these different ways to attack the system, and they'll try it. If it works, then it doesn't work. If it works, then it works. So, in the case of Cubic Ninja, it worked, but there might have been other games where they had that same level editor, but it always checks the code to make sure that it's not, running unsigned code. And they might have already tried, I guess, going through that process on other games, for example. The Johnny what joke? What's that?
Class, you're also going to hear it. So I have a very, very old joke. So let's say that there was a hacker family. This couple gets married. They're both hackers, and they decide to have a kid. What they decide to go and name the kid is Johnny Drop Tables Smith. I'd actually have to go and look for like what the actual. You do? Is this screen sharing? Yeah. Well, let's just say there's a lot of crazy syntax with this specific joke. So what ends up happening is Johnny Drop Tables goes to school for the first time. And on the very first day, his mother gets a call, and the IT for the school says, "What did your kid do? The second that I entered in your kid to the system, my entire database broke." So then the mother says, "Well, that means that you should have sanitized your fields." And then she hangs up, and then they congratulate each other. Okay, yeah, that's exactly what it was. I'd have to go and find it on here for the Zoom, but it's XKCD number 327. Yeah, XKCD is a pretty funny comic strip. So essentially what it was is, because the database wasn't sanitized, what that means within the field itself, like if any of y'all have taken the database class, there's multiple fields that you enter in text. Usually the database is expecting only text, not things like numbers, not things like commas, not things like commands. And drop tables means exactly what you think it means. It drops the entire table of all those lists of names. So what ends up happening, similar to what Ethan's talking about Cubic Ninja, it did not check to make sure that it was actually just normal names or normal commands. You could actually add in different commands, and it didn't check to stop it or sanitize it. There's also a rubber ducky joke somewhere that I completely forget about, but it's actually a little bit funny. Just because if you're not checking your fields to be specific to only, hey, make sure this is only going into a string as opposed to an actual command. And a string is usually what we do for like text to go and name something, naming something without having it be confused with a command. That's usually where the joke comes in. And if you take Pike, you'll hear it again. You'll probably hear it again, probably at your first job. This joke is probably older than myself, but it still is funny every time. And that's exactly what happened with Cubic Ninja.
But yeah, so basically, hackers, when they see a console, they immediately spot, areas that might be vulnerable, and then they kind of attack it through there. If it doesn't work, then oh well. But if it works, then it goes through. Yeah, so if there's any other questions, just drop it in the chat or say it out loud. We're good.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and the cyber. Oh, Jordan Wheeler has a question. I think he was raising his hand. Never mind.
Yeah, I'm curious if the presenter knows if there's a database of like the top 10 hardware vulnerabilities. I'm thinking of like OWASP top 10 for web applications, or CVE for network vulnerabilities, software vulnerabilities. Do you know if there's any similar database for hardware hacks?
Not that I'm aware of. Because I think for one, the motherboards and all the hardware kind of almost differ. For example, like the JTAG ports on the Xbox 360, that might not be available on, say, the Wii or the PS4. So it's kind of, I think, there's a period where I think hackers kind of need to analyze the hardware itself and kind of just look for those, I guess, vulnerable areas for the hardware side of things. As for software, I'm not too sure if there is kind of like a list out there that we can use to pinpoint those vulnerable areas and kind of use that as an attack vector. I'm not too sure for that.
Otherwise, I do appreciate y'all coming in, and remember that we will be looking for more cybersecurity researchers for next semester if you are interested in the project that Ethan's been doing. I know it will be a very different project for next semester. I don't know if you have any ideas on what you want to do for next semester.
I'm not too sure yet. I might kind of want to look into networking. I've also, I guess, kind of hosted a home server over the summer and kind of had that as a personal project. So I was kind of thinking about looking into that and kind of using it. So I guess you guys can have your own servers and also implement cybersecurity knowledge into it. And
what is exactly being a researcher for you entail?
Being a researcher, basically just kind of learning new topics, but I want the said topics to kind of be applicable to, I guess, your own personal life. I want this to be kind of something that you can use. So something like a home server, I think, would be a pretty interesting topic. But, if someone else has, a similar idea where this knowledge can be used and, at home just for personal things, I think that would also be a pretty cool topic to look into for the next semester.
Okay, that's really cool. So definitely if you aren't involved in a research team just yet, I do recommend for y'all to come in. Alumni are also welcome if any of y'all are graduating next semester. We do appreciate seeing our alumni swing by. But otherwise, I definitely do appreciate seeing y'all here, and I hope that y'all have a nice rest of your day.